Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we are going to talk about dead people. The topic of today's video is something that has been on my mind for years. Literally, I've been wrestling with this as long as I've been in the craft. And that is an apparent tension in Wicca between a doctrine of reincarnation and the practice of necromancy. Wicca prides itself on not really having doctrine, right? Wiccans like to say that Wicca is an orthoprax religion rather than an orthodox religion, so it's more about what you do than about what you believe. And while that's certainly true, there are some beliefs that are hiding in the background of a lot of traditional Wiccan ritual. I've talked about this in a previous video. Broadly speaking, I think that a lot of Gardnerian ritual is written with three main beliefs in mind, and those are a belief in magic, a belief in at least two deities, and a belief in reincarnation. Now, that's not to say that you have to believe in any or all of those things in order to be Wiccan, right? I know Wiccans who believe in any combination of all or none of those things, but a lot of Wiccan ritual is sort of written with the assumption that that's where you're at. And if that's not what you believe, then it's up to you to figure out what you're getting out of Wiccan ritual and how the language of Wiccan ritual still speaks to you poetically. So what I'm really interested in today is that last one, that belief in reincarnation. Reincarnation is a pretty heavy theme in a lot of Wiccan ritual. Gerald Gardner talks about it very explicitly in his published books. Philip Heselton has a line in his book, In Search of the New Forest Coven, where he quotes someone saying that they think of Wicca more as a reincarnation cult than as a fertility cult. Personally, I think it's a little bit of both, but reincarnation is a really serious theme in Wicca. And that's sort of broadly construed, right? That has to do with the cycles of the seasons, the phases of the moon. There's this big sort of abstract metaphor that everything that dies comes back and nature moves in cycles. But one of the ways that that theme manifests is a very specific idea of human souls reincarnating after death. So Gardner talks about this quite explicitly in Witchcraft Today. He says there's this idea that when you die, you pass to the land of the dead for a while, you sort of rejuvenate and refresh yourself, and then you return to this world in order to sort of do it all again. And I know lots of Wiccans who don't really buy into direct one-to-one reincarnation. I know lots of Wiccans who think of reincarnation much more as sort of an abstract, metaphorical thing about how when I die, the matter that makes up my body will decompose and return to the earth, providing nutrients for trees that will grow. So death gives way to life in this more abstract sense. But at least the way that early Wiccans talked about it and the way that some Wiccan ritual is structured, there really does seem to be an explicit focus on this idea of, like, when you die, you go to the underworld, and then you come back in a new body. And at the same time, let's take the whole reincarnation thing, let's stick it over here. Over here, we have the practice of necromancy, which is very common in Wicca. I won't go so far as to say that it's universal in Wicca, but certainly a lot of Wiccan covens, a lot of Wiccan practitioners are performing magic that involves communicating with the dead in some way. Whether that is ancestral veneration, whether that is trying to commune with the spirits of past witches, whether that is divination by means of a spirit board or transmediumship or other means of communicating with the dead, a lot of Wiccans communicate with the dead or honor the dead in some way. The most obvious example is at Samhain. A lot of Wiccans will perform some kind of ritual that involves sort of inviting our beloved dead to, come hang out with us and cross over from the other world to spend time in this world with us once again. And those two things, the necromancy and the reincarnation, don't quite fit together, because if we take reincarnation seriously, you go to the underworld, you hang out there for some period of time, some undetermined period of time, but, presumably not forever. And then you leave the underworld and you come back to this world to be reborn in a new body. So if I'm at a Samhain ritual and I'm inviting my great-grandmother to come back over from the other world, and she comes and we hang out and spill the tea, hasn't she reincarnated already? Isn't she reborn as some coal miner in West Virginia now? And if maybe you think that my great-grandmother hasn't reincarnated yet, but then push it back a generation or two, right? My great-great-grandmother, my thrice-great-grandmother, eventually we're going to hit someone who should have reincarnated already. And yet we can and do perform necromantic magic that involves communing with the spirits of the dead, even back several generations. And so there's an apparent conflict here. There's a tension between this idea of reincarnation and this practice of necromancy, both of which are fairly well built into Wicca. And this is a thing that I just like to sit with. I think that people are very eager to come up with solutions to these problems, to sort of explain them away, to make it seem like there isn't a problem at all. I don't like to do that. Let's just sit, let's acknowledge that these two things don't look like they go together. And let's just let ourselves feel that discomfort for a minute. I've heard a couple of different pitches for how these things can be resolved, how they can be made to fit together. I've had some ideas of my own over the course of the past several years, which have changed pretty substantially. Currently, I do have my own personal thoughts about how reincarnation and necromancy fit together. I have not shared those thoughts with anyone. So there are people with whom I've talked about this problem before in the past, and I've shared previous iterations of my thoughts. But what I currently think about the subject, I haven't shared, and I don't really intend to share with anyone else. Because I think that this is one of the really interesting things about Wicca. Not so much specifically the reincarnation and necromancy thing, but the idea that Wicca doesn't have a really robust, built-up doctrine, doesn't have a discursive theology. There are things in Wicca that don't make sense on the surface, and it's each individual Wiccan's job to dig into those and find what's in the center that makes it make sense, that makes it feel right. And my answers to that are going to be different from someone else's answers to that, and that's okay. Wicca is an experiential religion. Wicca is a mystery religion. And the doing of Wicca is about experiencing the mystery for yourself and coming to your own sort of personal reflective understanding of the gods or magic, or in this case, the afterlife, in a way that doesn't depend on everyone else agreeing with you. So I actually think it's a very good thing that people have the opportunity to see this problem, see these two things that don't look like they fit together, and to come to an understanding of it on their own without sort of trying to establish a consensus with other people, without debating out in the open, right? I think this is a thing built into Wicca that, is a little bit contradictory, and that's okay, because the contradiction stimulates something in you. And it helps you reach for a greater, deeper mystery that has to do with the cyclical nature of the universe and the relationship between the gods and death and various other sort of big mysteries in Wicca. So I have my own personal thoughts about this. I'm not going to share those personal thoughts in this video. And who knows, I might not ever share those personal thoughts because they're kind of for me. That said, let's talk through, I think, 3 really big and common ideas that I hear bandied about when this question of reincarnation and necromancy comes up. The first is that some people will say something to the effect of, time is an illusion, time exists in this world, in the way that we interact with this world, but it doesn't necessarily exist in the other world, or in the world of the dead. So while we may, from our perspective, seem to be experiencing a series of chronologically ordered lives, reincarnations. From the perspective of the other world, that chronological ordering doesn't exist. And there are just sort of all these different lives that are sort of concurrent, right? So I'm living this life as me, as Jack, right now in the year 2023 in New Jersey, and sort of simultaneously, I'm living my past life as a coal miner in West Virginia, and I'm living the life before that as, whatever, a troubadour. And I'm living the life that will come after this one, because the idea of a temporal succession is something sort of perspectival and limited to our point of view in this world, rather than sort of the ultimate reality or the perspective of things from the other world. So there's this idea that sometimes gets brought up that the version of you that exists in the other world is sort of the underlying self that is atemporal, that exists outside of time, and that is simultaneously experiencing all these different lifetimes. This is something that you see in some of like the Jane Roberts Seth material from the 70s. There's a book called The Education of Oversoul 7, which I have never actually read, but which deals with very explicitly this sort of idea of what's called an oversoul, right? The soul that unites all of the different lives across time, and that sort of exists in this atemporal liminal space. So that oversoul can always be in the afterlife, even while successive reincarnations are happening. Now, I don't actually like that approach. I don't like that theory. I think there's some stuff about it that just doesn't actually work if you really dig into it. Particularly because when we do necromancy, we aren't inviting the oversoul of great grandma to come back and visit us. We're inviting very specifically the personality of great grandma, who used to make us cookies and come to our baseball games. And that's not the same thing as this amorphous entity that exists across all the lifetimes at all points in time. So for me, it just doesn't work, but it's a solution that a lot of people bring up and seem to really like. A second solution that people bring up and seem to really like, and this is one that I actually previously was really enthusiastic about, is the idea that the soul has multiple parts, and that those parts do different things after death. So you might have one part that reincarnates, you might have one part of the soul that goes to the land of the dead, you might have one part of the soul that rejoins with the divine source of all life, and you could have as many parts of the soul as you want. And this is something that exists across various traditions. So in Kemetic religion, there are various parts of the soul pretty explicitly discussed in religious texts, and these include your shadow and your heart, the Ka and the Ba, and so on. And each of these has a different purpose, a different function while you're alive, and then once you die, there are different stories about the things that happen to each of these various parts of the soul. You also find it in things like Norse religion. You see it in certain strands of Hinduism or Buddhism, which then sort of got brought over to the West and in a very sketchy way incorporated into some Western mysticism by the likes of Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society. And so, the idea of parts of the soul is certainly not alien to the occult scene. I think the history of it in modern Western occultism is really fraught and has a complicated colonial legacy that we should maybe think about unpacking. But it's an idea that exists kind of pervasively throughout a lot of the world, and it does seem to really beautifully reconcile some of this problem. Again, I think there's a lot about that solution that makes sense, that seems really nice. There are some things about it that I don't entirely love, chiefly being that you fall very quickly into speculative territory, and there's sort of this worry of ontological profligacy with generating more and more parts of the soul. So how many parts of the soul do you need in order to accommodate whatever you have going on? And you might say two, you might say one part of the soul to reincarnate, one part to go to the realm of the dead, but then maybe there's a reason that you decide that you want to add in a third part of the soul and then a fourth part of the soul, and I think in I'm not an expert on Tantra, but I think in Tantra there are the five, what are they called? The five koshas, something like that. So there are some traditions where there are 5 parts of the soul. Helena Blavatsky talks about 7 parts of the soul, and it just you can just keep generating, right? So I think if you want to go the route of thinking that there are parts of the soul, you have to have really good reasons for hammering down what parts of the soul you think there are and what parts you think there aren't, and where you draw that line. Which is not to say that that work can't be done, and obviously there are specific religious traditions that have very particular teachings about that kind of thing. But if we're sort of coming at this from a Wiccan perspective and trying to sort of adopt wisdom from those other traditions, I think there's a question about how you make that sort of decision. And finally, a third approach to the necromancy problem is that some people, particularly I think people with more of a chaos magic bent, will talk about necromancy as not exactly actually communing with the soul of a dead person, but more constructing a thought form or an energetic entity that draws on a lot of sort of the magical energy that a person produced or left behind, or what is remembered about them, in a way where you're interacting with something that is very similar to that person, but you're not actually interacting with the soul of your dead grandma. And they might even have something very similar to say about reincarnation, right? So there are ways to talk about both necromancy and reincarnation where you just get a little bit less iron-fistedly literal about it, and once you relax your grip on that, that can solve a lot of your problems. I think that's a viable solution. It's not a solution that appeals to me personally, but it's on the table. I think there is a sense in which it sort of feels like you're giving up the goose. Oh yeah, we have reincarnation and necromancy, but the way they fit together is that the reincarnation isn't really reincarnation, and the necromancy isn't really necromancy. Again, that's just my personal perspective. There are a lot of people for whom that approach is much more appealing, and like I said earlier, I think the point of this sort of thing is that it's something for everyone to wrestle with individually and come to a solution that feels right to them. So just because none of these 3 solutions really sit properly with me and feel right to me does not mean that they are wrong, does not mean that you should not adopt them, anything like that. It's your business of ijtihad is yours, right? It's intentionally personal, and it doesn't require consensus from the outside. Ijtihad is a word from Islam. It roughly means a personal struggle of exegetical interpretation. I won't go too much into it. It's a word with a fascinating etymology, but exegesis is more or less what it boils down to. So your personal exegesis of this problem is yours, and mine is mine, and that's what makes the world go round. No, but more seriously, I think that this is a genuine problem not in the sense of being something damning, not being something that tears Wicca down, but a problem in the sense of this is problematic. This is a thing that requires discursive thought and consideration in order for us to, arrive at something that feels correct. It's a problem not in the sense of being bad, but in the sense of being something that you need to engage with quite seriously, and that is supposed, I don't know if it's supposed to, I don't know if it's intentional, but something that, the process of engaging with this stimulates, I think, deep personal theological and meditative reflection in a way that enhances your engagement with your religious practice. So I think this is a problem in a very good way, in a way that we should be encouraging ourselves and each other to take this kind of thing seriously and just sit in the discomfort of it Wicca tells us two things that don't look like they go together. What do we do about that? And everyone's answer is going to be different because everyone's Wicca is different. But that's great. Like, that's the point. So, I'm going to leave off there. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I will talk to you all sometime soon. Bye.